President Trump reportedly rejecting Ukrainian President Zelensky's request for Tomahawk missiles after their latest face-to-face at the White House.
During that meeting, the commander-in-chief calling on both Ukraine and Russia to stop the war immediately.
Madeline Rivera is live in Washington with the latest on Trump's push for peace in this situation. Maddie, good morning.
Good morning. So this is not the outcome President Zelensky wanted, especially after President Trump indicated last weekend he could send Ukraine Tomahawks if Russia did not agree to settling the war. President Trump now appearing to back off that position, refusing to send Ukraine the weapons for now. Sources tell Axios he showed no flexibility on the issue at their meeting on Friday, despite Zelensky's push, as he's concerned the weapons could undermine his efforts at diplomacy.
We need Tomahawk, so we need a lot of other weapons that we're sending to Ukraine. One of the reasons we want to get this war over is exactly that. It's not easy for us to give. You're talking about massive numbers of very powerful weapons. So that's one of the things we'll be talking about. Hopefully they won't need it. Hopefully we'll be able to get the war over with without thinking about Tomahawks. I think we're fairly close to that.
The shift comes after the president held a lengthy phone call with Russian President Vladimir Putin on Thursday. Zelensky says Putin is afraid of Tomahawks, and they would be a game changer in this war, allowing Ukraine to hit deep into Russia. Ukraine lately has been targeting Russia's energy infrastructure with the help, reportedly, of U.S. intelligence. But the Washington Post editorial board says the talk of Tomahawks is simply part of a larger pressure campaign as the president tries to corner Putin into making a deal.
What do you see as the biggest difference in diplomacy between President Trump and President Biden?
President Trump is really showed for the world that he can manage ceasefire in the Middle East, and that's why I hope that he will do this, and we will also have such big success.
I would say the biggest difference is one is extremely competent, and the other one is grossly incompetent.
Truth Social post, President Trump says Ukraine and Russia should stop where they are, suggesting the front lines would be frozen in place, perhaps a difficult pill for Ukraine to swallow. Charlie, Rachel, and Griff.
Thanks, Maddie.
Thanks, Maddie.
Thank you very much. In that last part about President Trump saying that one was competent, one was grossly incompetent, that the question was about the difference between his administration's approach to Biden's administration. And we know, obviously, in the case of the Middle East, President Trump was able to release the hostages and get this peace train moving in the Middle East because he was bringing maximum pressure, not just on Israel, which is what the Biden administration quietly tried to do, but also on Hamas. And the threat of letting Netanyahu unleash and take the gloves off brought Hamas to the table because they realized what was happening. Now you have Zelensky at this meeting. This meeting obviously went much better than the last one where President Trump kicked Zelensky out of the meeting. They both had this 2.5-hour conversation, and President Trump is not willing to give those Tomahawk missiles to Zelensky yet because that would allow Zelensky to strike Moscow, because the range of Tomahawk missiles is plenty to get to Moscow and to other places strategically within Russia. And we're waiting to see what happens with this meeting when President Trump will meet with Putin in Hungary. We talked to Dan Hoffman, the former CIA station chief in Moscow. Here's a little bit of his take on it. Watch.
President Trump, I think, believes he's got one last chance in this next Budapest summit to get a deal done, a ceasefire done, without having to give Ukraine Tomahawk missiles, without having to impose coercive economic sanctions that our Congress has warmed up in the bullpen. The evidence points to absolutely no indication that Putin is ready to stop the war. And so we'll just have to see whether President can cajole the Russians, influence the Russians at that upcoming summit. I think it's going to be a tall task, but if it doesn't work, then the president has absolutely every right, every means to up the ante. Russia's our adversary. The last thing Putin wants is for President Trump to notch a win. What scares Putin the most is everything that is enshrined in our Constitution and Bill of Rights, democracy.
You know, I'm not sure if I agree with how Dan Hoffman was assessing this. So President Trump actually met with Putin first and then Zelensky, and everyone thought that because President Trump had been saying, you know, I reserve the right to give them these Tomahawk missiles and escalate this war. He meets with Putin, and then he meets with Zelenskyy. And all of a sudden, with Zelenskyy, he's like, no, I'm not going to give you the weapons. And he's sort of cooled off on that whole thing, and he wants peace. And so the question is, what changed? There's a lot of things that could have changed. It could have been the win in Israel and the sort of global accolades that he received for being the peacemaker in that. It's certainly increased his standing on the global stage, and so he may just want yet another peace win. I think there might be another component to this. Look at what's happening right now in the Caribbean. It's very clear that President Trump wants to end the rule of Maduro, which is wreaking havoc all over our hemisphere, and it has a lot to do with China. And a piece of the puzzle, the client state you have Iran, but mostly it's China and Russia who have been able to support Maduro. If you can get the Russians to pull out and help further isolate Maduro and stop that help, maybe the terms for this Ukraine-Russian deal are a little bit better for the Russians than they thought it would be if they're helpful in this situation with Venezuela. Because what the Venezuela situation is about China, who is our number one enemy and problem in the world, but especially in our own hemisphere.
Well, certainly President Trump has, brought the ire from all sides on, in particular with Ukraine and the issue of the Tomahawks. His greatest credibility and the reason he was able to achieve what he's been able to achieve so far is his credibility, his ability to go to both sides and say, look, man, I'm an open book and I'm willing to hear you out and I'm going to make a decision. And so, the thing I would caution against reading too much into, going back to the Tomahawk missiles, whether he was thinking about giving them the Tomahawks or deciding not to give Ukraine the Tomahawks out of fear that it could escalate the war. Trump is looking at the long term. He's looking at long range. He's looking at the big picture, like you're talking about. He's concerned about like sort of the big global picture that involves China and our hemisphere, which is a lot closer to us than Europe. And so, I think that he has earned the respect, unlike either of his predecessors. He has earned the respect to give him the room to make those decisions.
The worst thing that happened from the American point of view, strategically, the worst thing that happened with the Ukraine-Russia war was that it brought China and Russia together.
Yes. Insane.
It was the most
unnatural allies, and they squished them together.
And we brought them together through this ridiculous, war that we, in many ways, could have stopped. Had Joe and President Trump says that all the time. So I think you're absolutely right. President Trump is playing. He's like, this is meta, right? He's playing a big, long game.
MAGA meta.
Yeah, it's MAGA meta, and this is about China and separating China and Russia and getting their help and helping us clean up our. I think this is very dynamic. I don't know what's happening exactly. Obviously, we can't know. But I have a feeling something is happening in that negotiation.
It's always, as Charlie said, about the long game. And we saw him call for peace in the Middle East and demand both sides stop fighting and then work backwards. Seems to be doing the same thing.